Hi, today I'm going to show you 5 simple embroidery stitches. First off is the running stitch, and a running stitch creates a dotted line like this. So to begin, you take your needle and thread and poke your needle up from the back to the front, and then back down through, back up, and down. And with this stitch, you can vary your stitch size for a little different look. You can make your stitches closer together or even further apart. And by doing that, it varies up your look as well. All right. And that is a running stitch. Okay, next we will do the back stitch. Now the back stitch, this orange line, creates a solid line and is good for outlining. So for this, again, just like before, we will bring from the back to the front and back down, just like when we were making our running stitch, right? Except for this time, we will lead out in front and bring the needle, push the needle back down through the same hole. There we go. And then back out in front and down. And then lead out in front and back down, and then come back up. And this one is another one where you can adjust your stitch size, although it won't really change the look at it, since what the purpose of this stitch is to make a continuous line or a solid line. So this is a great stitch for outlining. All right. And you're always sharing the hole with a stitch, and that's how you create a continuous line rather than having little spaces in between each one. Okay, there's the back stitch. Now let's work a split stitch. And what a split stitch is it creates a little bit more texture. It's another stitch that's great for outlining, or you can use it to fill an area, but it just gives a little bit more of a raised texture. Now, a split stitch is created, start just the same way as we have before. So we bring our needle up through and back down. Except this time, what we're going to do is bring our needle back up through the middle of that stitch, splitting the stitch, right? And then lead back out in front. All right, and then back up through, splitting that stitch. And again, lead out in front and splitting the stitch. All right, see? Simple, right? So this is another one. You can vary the stitch size, and the smaller that you make these little split stitches, the more they'll pop up, and they'll be just a little more rounded looking. Sorry, it's hard to see that. Okay, so bring your needle up through and lead out in front. Needle back up through and back through the front, right? And that is a split stitch. Okay. See the difference there? It's very slight. Okay, now we'll move on to more of a fill stitch. And a fill stitch means that you're using it to fill an area with stitches. So a good one to use that's really simple is the Satin Stitch. And so I'll show you how this is done. All right. I cut off some of my old needles here. Okay, so a satin stitch, we are going to bring your needle up from the back to the front, as always, and then back down. So here we are, we've made a single stitch. And then you're going to bring it back up right next to your original stitch. And back down right next to, not in the same hole, but right next to that previous stitch. And I'm making this kind of a waved line on the bottom so you can see how it works as a fill stitch. Okay, and you're always just kind of wrapping it around. So you're starting on one side, bringing it up through on one side, and putting it back down through on the other side. Bringing it up on one side and back down through on the other side. Bringing it up and back down through. Now if you notice, let's say you have not brought your stitch up quite close enough to that previous stitch and you end up having a space. Now you can just, it's not a problem, just go back in and fill in that little space where it seems like a stitch is missing, because that's all you're doing is replacing that stitch. But can you see how this goes down, how it creates a nice smooth surface? Now this is one that you can vary the size. Obviously you can bring it out a little bit more, bring it back in without having to start a new stitch. It's just really easy to adjust wherever you bring your thread out, and wherever you choose to put it back in, you're creating that width of the stitch. But it is just that nice, smooth outline. Or not outline, but fill, right? Okay, so there is our satin stitch. Next, let's do, and let me show you the back side of this. So with a satin stitch, this is what happens. It's going to look very similar from the back side to the front. Okay. Okay, now French knots. French knots can be a little bit tricky, but once you know how to do them, and the more you practice, the easier they'll get. Okay, so with a French knot, what you're going to do, and let me show you this. So French knots are these little, just like, almost like little seeds that pop out from the fabric. They're fun to use. They give you some really nice texture. Okay, so a French knot, you are bringing your thread out from the back to the front as usual. And then we are wrapping the thread around the needle. You can do this once, twice, 3 times. And then you're reinserting the needle right next to where you started your stitch. And keep in mind here, I'm going to hold that thread tight. This hand can do anything, but this needs to hold the thread tight because it's keeping that tightness so that you have a nice tight French knot when you pull it all the way through. Now, the way to do this typically is the faster the better. Oh boy, that's the worst that can happen right there. So that's a good lesson right there. So with French knots, the shorter your thread is probably better, especially in the beginning. The slower that you make these, the more you increase your chance of creating an unintentional knot. All right, so we'll try this again. Let me do it quicker, and then I'll show you a slower version. So I'm wrapping, putting my needle back in right next to that where I brought it out initially, and pulling it through quickly. See that? All right. Again, bring it out, wrap your thread. You can wrap it towards you or you can wrap it again away from you. It doesn't matter, but you're just reinserting that needle right next to the hole, keeping this thread tight. Make sure you don't have any tangles in there, and just quickly pull it through. Okay. Now, the easiest way to make a mistake with these is to not keep that side tight. So if I had just done this and pulled my knot through, see how it makes that knot that's a little sloppy looking? It's going to be bigger and not so tight, whereas these are tight. This one is likely to come undone over time. Okay, so the key here again, wrap the thread around the needle, stick the needle back into the thread, and pull through. Got it? Like I said, you can wrap this multiple times or just a single time. The key is always just to keep that side tight. So the hand that I'm holding my hoop with, keeping it tight until I can't hold on to it anymore. It's too tight, and then I'll let it go and pull through. That's going to give you the best chance for a really nice French knot. So until you get really adept at making French knots, what I would suggest is just making one at a time and then knotting off. So what I mean by knotting off is tying a knot on the back. Okay. And then starting a new French knot. Okay. All right, and then you can tie it off. Because if you had made, the reason why I say that is that if you had made a series of French knots and then you had one that doesn't work, well then you have to cut that one off and you have a loose thread on the back. So, and it's typically too small to tie off. So until you get really comfortable with French knots, just my suggestion is just to make one at a time. Okay, well, I hope that was helpful. And yeah, thanks so much.